Well, that raises the question again. Not that begs the question. Begging the question is a logical flaw in an argument. That was extra. Don't say that begs the question when what you mean is that raises the question. Okay? That was extra. So that raises the question, what is the gospel? What is the gospel? Here's what's interesting. It came down to the last phrase. And as I'm working through the whole time we've been in Romans, just being saturated in the gospel, asking myself, how would you communicate what the gospel is in a succinct manner? And as I'm thinking through it, he makes this statement. He goes and he looks at Isaiah, several passages in Isaiah, and he brings them together in this statement. And look at what he says. Go to verse 32. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. It's two ways. It's either faith or works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written. And then here's the statement. Paul is not saying here that this is the gospel. But if you look at the elements in the statement that he makes, what you see are the elements of a gospel-centered statement. Now, I'll explain that in a moment. But for now, just look at the statement. Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. There's the difference between the two. The difference between the two is that the Gentile has come based upon this truth that we find in the Old Testament. Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him shall not be put to shame. That is a succinct statement that has all the major elements of the gospel. Let me explain. Paul makes a statement earlier on in chapter 1. Let me say it, read it. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, the Jew first and also the Greek. Thesis statement for the book of Romans, basically. Everything else that I'm about to say is about this right here. What is the gospel? How is man made right before God, the Jew and also the Greek? For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. How are we right before God? The answer is the gospel. The gospel is that power that makes us right before God. So what are the main elements? Let me give you these 5 things that I believe you see here in this statement. It has all of these characteristics that will help us to remember these 5 things about what the gospel is. First of all, the gospel is news. The gospel is news. How does he start his statement out? Behold, listen up, hear ye, hear ye. I'm making a statement, I'm making a declaration. The gospel is news. The word for gospel, euangelion, it means announcement. It means news. The gospel is news. By the way, let me put this footnote here. We do not live the gospel. We cannot live the gospel. Okay? That's foolishness. You don't live news. For me to say I'm going to live out the gospel is like me saying I'm going to live out the front page story in the newspaper yesterday. If I came to you and I said, hey man, I've decided I'm going to live out the front page story in the newspaper yesterday, what would you say to me? Actually, that's news that happened yesterday. You can't live it out. You don't live the gospel. And so if somebody walks up to you, well, you know, like St. Francis said, preach the gospel at all times and when necessary, use words. You look at them and you say, he didn't know what the gospel is, obviously, because nobody who knows what the gospel is would say such foolishness. You have to use words to preach the gospel. Whether they're written words or spoken words, you have to use words. Why? Because the gospel is news. That would be like saying, give the news at all times, and when necessary, use words. And then you turn on the television, And there's a bunch of people out there just sort of living their lives. And you look at it and somehow you're supposed to determine what the news is. Are you following me? Is it beginning to register? Because you don't like what I just said because you hear it so often that you've begun to accept it and maybe even say it yourself. We just have to live out the gospel. You can't live out the gospel. The gospel is news. Now, you can live in light of the gospel. You can live because of the gospel, but you cannot live the gospel. Here's the other thing. The gospel is news about what God has done in Jesus Christ. For me to think that I can live the gospel is to put myself in the place of Christ. That's blasphemy. You don't need the news about Jesus. Just watch me. Help you if you can say that without having a desire to crawl up under one of these chairs. The gospel is not something we live. The gospel is news from, about, for, through God. Because the gospel is God-centered. The gospel is not just news, but it is God-centered news. The center and the core of the gospel is what God has done, not what I have done. The center and the core of the gospel is what God has done. Let me say that again. The gospel is news from, about, for, and through God. The gospel is not just news, it is God-centered news. If you are at the center of your discussion about the gospel, then it's not a discussion about the gospel. If it's a discussion about the gospel, God will be at the center of it, not you. God. It's God-centered. Listen to this. Now, after John was arrested, this is Mark 1:14. And after John was arrested, Jesus came into Galilee preaching the gospel of God. I love that. The gospel is God-centered. This also means that the gospel is not man-centered. The gospel doesn't begin with God loves you and has a wonderful plan with for your life. The gospel is not about you. The gospel is about God. The gospel is about creation, fall, redemption, and consummation. Creation by God, fall from God, redemption to God, consummation through God. It is God-centered. What role does man play in the gospel? The role that man plays in the gospel is the foil. You're the problem in the gospel. But the way we usually talk about the gospel is not at all God-centered, it's man-centered. And here's what it sounds like. You are so awesome that God made the world just so that one day he could look at you. And you're also so awesome that God sent his son Jesus because he couldn't imagine life without you in eternity. And so he stands here right now pleading with you, begging you, because he just cannot imagine his life without you. Would you please do God the favor of accepting Christ so that he can finally be at peace because he's got you? That is not the gospel. The gospel is God-centered, not man-centered. The gospel is not about how special you are. The gospel is about how sovereign God is. The gospel is not about how much God needs or wants you. The gospel is about how much you need God. The gospel is not about how bad things are going to be for God if you don't come. The gospel is about how bad things are for you and will continue to be for you throughout eternity if you do not get God-centered like the gospel. That's the gospel. Behold, I lay in Zion. That's the statement. Behold, I lay in Zion. It is about what God has done. It is about who God is. It is not about you.